In a small, peaceful town, the disappearance of 34-year-old Sarah Matthews sent shockwaves through the community. She was a beloved elementary school teacher and a mother of 2 young children. Sarah's life seemed perfect to everyone who knew her. She had a loving husband, Mark, and 2 beautiful kids, Emma and Noah. Her friends described her as a kind and caring person who always put others first. However, on one cold November evening, Sarah vanished without a trace, and the idyllic image of her life began to crack. It all started when Sarah failed to return home from her usual evening walk. Her husband, Mark, had expected her back by dusk, but as the hours ticked by, he grew more anxious. He called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Thinking she had perhaps lost track of time, Mark waited for her. But when midnight came, and she still hadn't come home, worry set in. The next morning, Mark reported Sarah missing. The police immediately launched a search, but there were few clues to follow. Sarah's car was found abandoned in a park on the outskirts of town. The engine was still warm, but the car doors were wide open, and the keys were missing. There was no sign of a struggle, and nothing seemed out of place inside the vehicle. It was as if Sarah had simply stepped out and walked away. But where had she gone, and why? As days turned into weeks with no sign of Sarah, the police began to investigate every lead they could find. They spoke to her friends, family, and colleagues, hoping for some clue that would point them in the right direction. But everyone seemed baffled. No one could fathom why Sarah would disappear on her own. She had a good job, a loving family, and everything to live for. One detail that seemed odd, however, was Sarah's calm demeanor in the days leading up to her disappearance. Friends recalled that she had been unusually quiet in the days prior, but nothing seemed amiss. Sarah hadn't mentioned any problems at home or any threats to her safety. It was as if she had been planning something, but no one could figure out what it was. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Mark Matthews, her husband, came under suspicion. Detectives were puzzled by his reaction to Sarah's disappearance. Unlike most people in similar situations, Mark remained eerily composed. While others in the community were desperate for answers, Mark seemed almost indifferent. He cooperated with the police, but didn't show the kind of emotion one would expect from a husband who had just lost his wife. He wasn't seen searching for Sarah, nor did he speak out to the media, urging anyone who might have information to come forward. Some of Sarah's friends began to whisper about their marriage. It was known that Sarah and Mark had been having some difficulties in recent months, but no one had thought it was serious enough to lead to something like this. Could Mark have been hiding something? Had he been involved in Sarah's disappearance? The detectives began to dig deeper into Mark's past, searching for any connection that could explain his strange behavior. Despite Mark's odd demeanor, the investigation seemed to stall. There were no leads, and no one had seen or heard anything unusual on the night Sarah went missing. For all intents and purposes, Sarah Matthews had simply disappeared into thin air. But as the weeks passed, one unsettling fact became clear. If Sarah had left voluntarily, she would have taken her belongings, especially her phone and wallet. But none of that was found, making it more likely that something sinister had occurred. Yet no one could figure out what that something was. As the community held its breath, hoping for news of Sarah's whereabouts, the case grew colder by the day. Everyone wondered, what happened to Sarah Matthews? And more importantly, who was responsible for her sudden and unexplained disappearance? As the weeks passed, the investigation into Sarah Matthews's disappearance seemed to hit a dead end. Her friends, family, and co-workers all continued to wonder what could have happened to her. Detective Miller, now leading the investigation, grew frustrated with the lack of new evidence. The few clues they had were vague, and the leads often seemed to go nowhere. Sarah's husband, Mark Matthews, remained the primary suspect, but the lack of motive or any concrete evidence kept him from being formally charged. Despite Mark's unsettling behavior, Miller didn't want to rush to conclusions. He decided to dig deeper into Sarah's life to see if anything had been hidden beneath the surface. As part of this, the detectives began reviewing Sarah's personal and professional records, hoping to find some hint of a hidden conflict or a secret life she might have been leading. That's when they uncovered an unexpected piece of information. Sarah had been keeping a journal, one that her closest friends didn't even know about. It wasn't filled with everyday musings, but rather detailed entries about her emotional state, some of which hinted at a troubled relationship. One of the most surprising discoveries in the journal was a mention of a man named Daniel Hargrove, someone Sarah had been seeing secretly for months. Daniel was new to the area, having recently moved to the town. He wasn't well known in the community, but his name came up often in Sarah's journal entries. At first, the mentions were innocent enough, notes about meeting up for coffee, talking about their mutual interests, and spending time together. But as the journal progressed, the tone shifted. Sarah seemed increasingly conflicted about her feelings for Daniel. She wrote about how she felt guilty about her marriage, but couldn't deny her attraction to him. Detective Miller's interest was piqued. The journal suggested an affair, and that meant a potential motive. Could Sarah's disappearance be linked to her secret relationship? Was Daniel Hargrove involved in some way? The more Miller looked into Daniel, the more troubling facts emerged. It turned out Daniel had a criminal history, having been convicted of several minor offenses in the past, including theft and fraud. While there was nothing to suggest he had committed anything violent, his past was enough to raise suspicion. But Daniel wasn't the only person in Sarah's life who raised red flags. Miller discovered that Sarah had been unusually distant with her husband in the months leading up to her disappearance. The tension between them was palpable. Friends and family had noticed that Sarah and Mark had been fighting more often, though no one knew the specifics. Some of Sarah's colleagues even noted that she had seemed tired and stressed, as if there was something weighing heavily on her mind. Could Mark have discovered the affair? Was he capable of violence? The deeper Miller dug into Sarah's personal life, the more complex the situation became. On the surface, it appeared as though she had everything: a family, a job she loved, and a stable home life. But behind closed doors, things were much murkier. There were whispers that Sarah's marriage to Mark had been falling apart for some time. He had been distant, and there were signs that he had been hiding things of his own. Was there a chance that Sarah had tried to leave him for Daniel? Or was it possible that Mark had learned about the affair and taken drastic action? With this new lead in hand, Miller began to question Sarah's friends and family more aggressively, seeking any information that might shed light on her relationship with Daniel or her marriage to Mark. But no one seemed to know much. Sarah had kept the affair hidden well, and most of her friends were shocked by the revelation. The mystery deepened further, leaving Miller with one burning question. What had happened to Sarah Matthews, and who was involved in her disappearance? The clues pointed to several possibilities, but none of them offered a clear answer. As the investigation moved forward, the case grew more complicated, and the truth seemed ever farther out of reach. The investigation into Sarah Matthews' disappearance took a sharp turn when new evidence came to light that none of the detectives had expected. While Daniel Hargrove remained a strong lead, a breakthrough came in the form of security footage from the local cafe where Sarah had been spotted just hours before she vanished. The footage revealed something that no one had anticipated: a meeting between Sarah and her husband, Mark. The video showed Sarah entering the cafe at around 5 p.m. on the day she disappeared. Mark was already sitting at a table, waiting for her. They spoke for a few minutes before leaving the cafe together. At first glance, it didn't seem suspicious. They appeared to be a married couple going about their day. But as detectives studied the footage more closely, something unsettling became apparent. Mark was unusually calm and composed, almost too composed. While Sarah seemed a bit more anxious, her movements were slow and deliberate, as though she were being led by Mark, not walking alongside him. It was a small detail, but it stuck out. They didn't seem like a couple having a casual conversation. It looked more like Mark was guiding her, almost as though she had no choice but to follow him. Detective Miller was taken aback. This footage directly contradicted Mark's earlier statements about where he had been that day. Mark had claimed that he had been at work all day, but the footage clearly showed him meeting Sarah. The detective now had a crucial question. If Mark had lied about his whereabouts, what else was he hiding? Was this an innocent meeting, or did it hold a more sinister meaning? As Miller and his team dug deeper, they realized that Mark's alibi didn't hold up. They contacted his workplace, only to discover that he had left work earlier than he had claimed. According to the time cards, Mark had punched out well before Sarah was last seen in the cafe. That raised more questions. Was Mark having an affair as well? Had he been involved in Sarah's disappearance? The detectives knew that something wasn't adding up. Mark had always been the perfect husband in the eyes of the community, a loving father, and a successful businessman. But now, with his alibi falling apart, it appeared that his perfect life might have been nothing more than an illusion. Still, there was no clear evidence that Mark had harmed Sarah. The footage, although strange, did not directly link him to any crime. It was just a meeting between a husband and wife, though it seemed more controlled than expected. Meanwhile, the investigation into Daniel Hargrove continued. Detectives found that he had been actively avoiding them since Sarah's disappearance, refusing to cooperate with the investigation. He also had a criminal record that suggested he was no stranger to illegal activities, though nothing in his past pointed to anything violent. But his refusal to help, combined with the knowledge of Sarah's affair with him, made him a prime suspect in the case. Was he involved in Sarah's disappearance? Could he have played a role in whatever had happened to her? The more they investigated, the more tangled the web became. As new information came in, the detectives began to wonder if Mark was hiding something more than just a lie about his whereabouts. Could it be that he was somehow involved in Sarah's disappearance, but had carefully crafted an alibi to cover his tracks? Was he trying to protect someone else, or perhaps even himself? At this point, the case had reached an impasse. The more the detectives dug, the more complicated the situation became. Mark's behavior was starting to look increasingly suspicious, and Daniel Hargrove's involvement seemed more likely, but there was still no concrete evidence tying either man directly to the crime. The investigation had uncovered more questions than answers, and the pressure to solve the case was mounting. Detective Miller knew that the key to understanding what had happened to Sarah Matthews lay in uncovering the truth behind that strange meeting between her and Mark, and what came next after they left the cafe. But with each new discovery, the twists and turns of the case seemed more and more like a puzzle that would be impossible to solve. As the investigation into Sarah Matthews' disappearance continued, Detective Miller's team uncovered even more shocking details that seemed to complicate the case further. While Sarah's husband, Mark, was still a primary suspect, the investigators had yet to find any clear evidence linking him to his wife's death. However, the deeper they looked into his background, the more concerning signs they discovered. The most damning piece of evidence was the discovery of financial irregularities tied to Mark's business dealings. It seemed that Mark had been involved in a series of shady investments and questionable transactions, all leading to mounting debt. Detectives found that Mark had been living beyond his means for months, borrowing large sums of money from obscure sources. Several of these loans were connected to offshore accounts, some of which were linked to high-risk illegal activities. While none of the transactions were overtly criminal, the circumstances surrounding the deals raised serious questions. Was Mark in financial trouble? Had this debt led him to do something drastic, such as harming his wife to cover up his misdeeds? Detective Miller couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had uncovered her husband's financial problems and decided to confront him. The situation took another unexpected turn when investigators found out that Sarah had, in fact, discovered Mark's financial troubles. A series of emails between Sarah and her close friend revealed that Sarah had been worried about the family's future. She had found out about the debt and had planned to confront Mark about it in the days leading up to her disappearance. The timing of these discoveries seemed more than coincidental. If Sarah had planned to leave Mark or threatened to expose his financial troubles, could that have been the breaking point? Was Mark's calm demeanor and unusual behavior after Sarah went missing part of a carefully crafted act to cover up his crime? As the investigation into Mark deepened, another twist emerged. Sarah's body was discovered in a secluded wooded area, not far from where her car had been found abandoned. Her body was badly decomposed, suggesting she had been dead for several weeks. But the cause of death was immediately apparent: blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon used to strike Sarah was a rare antique hammer that had been passed down through the Matthews family for generations. The hammer was an unmistakable heirloom, and its absence from the Matthews home had not gone unnoticed. At first, detectives speculated that it might have been stolen during a break-in. But as the investigation continued, one chilling detail came to light. Mark's fingerprints were all over the hammer. The discovery sent shock waves through the investigation. It seemed impossible that Sarah's own husband could have used such a personal and distinctive weapon to kill her. Yet all evidence pointed to Mark being the last person to handle it. The fingerprints on the hammer were undeniable, but there was one problem. Mark claimed that he hadn't seen the hammer in years. The family had kept it locked away in a display case, a cherished relic from a past generation. How had it ended? Up being used to kill Sarah? And why had Mark's fingerprints been found on it? Detective Miller now faced a dilemma. The evidence against Mark was damning, but there was one more issue that continued to nag at him. 2 weeks before Sarah's death, someone had broken into the Matthews home and stolen the hammer. Whoever had stolen it had carefully removed it from the display case, taken it, and left without a trace. This person had also covered their tracks very well, leaving no fingerprints behind. The obvious question was, who had taken the hammer, and why? As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the case began to seem even more convoluted. Mark Matthews, once the obvious suspect, now seemed to be an unwitting pawn in a much larger and more elaborate game. Had someone framed him for his wife's murder? Or was Mark, in fact, the killer, his carefully planned alibi unraveling bit by bit as new evidence emerged. The discovery of the hammer left Detective Miller more confused than ever. The case had turned into a complex web of lies, secrets, and hidden motives. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. Sarah Matthews' death had all the markings of a well-orchestrated plan, and someone was determined to make sure Mark took the fall for it. The question was, who? And why go to such great lengths to pin the murder on him? The mystery deepened further as the truth seemed just out of reach, and Miller knew that the final twist was still waiting to be uncovered. The investigation into Sarah Matthews' disappearance and death reached its explosive conclusion when Detective Miller uncovered the true killer, a revelation that shocked everyone involved. After weeks of dead ends, misleading clues, and false leads, the breakthrough came in the most unexpected way, a deep dive into Sarah's family history and her relationships. It was a detail that had been overlooked in the initial rush of the investigation, but it turned out to be the key that unlocked the entire case. The true killer was someone no one had suspected, Sarah's own sister, Emily Matthews. The story of Emily's involvement with Sarah's murder was a twisted tale of greed, jealousy, and betrayal. For years, Emily had been overshadowed by her more successful and well-liked sister. Sarah had always been the golden child, the one with the perfect family, a steady job, and the admiration of everyone around her. Emily, on the other hand, had struggled with financial issues and had been excluded from the Matthews family's inheritance. It had eaten away at her for years, and as Sarah's life continued to flourish, Emily became consumed by resentment and envy. It was in this toxic environment that Emily had learned of Sarah's affair with Daniel Hargrove. The discovery of the affair had been a breaking point for Emily. She saw an opportunity to exploit Sarah's vulnerability and to exact revenge on her sister, who had everything Emily felt she deserved. Emily's plan was chilling in its execution. She would use Daniel's presence in Sarah's life to manipulate the situation and set up the perfect crime. She would frame Daniel for Sarah's disappearance, casting suspicion on him while covering her own tracks. Emily had known about the family heirloom hammer, a relic passed down through generations. She knew how important it was to the Matthews family, and she realized that if she could steal it, she could use it as the weapon to kill Sarah and make it look like Mark had been the one responsible. So, 2 weeks before Sarah's death, Emily had broken into the Matthews home and stolen the hammer, carefully removing it from its display case and hiding it until the time was right. She then waited, knowing that Sarah would confront her husband about his financial problems and their troubled marriage. When Sarah finally planned to confront Mark about the affair, Emily seized the moment. She murdered her sister in cold blood, striking her with the hammer before staging the scene to make it appear as though Mark was responsible. She had even planted evidence to suggest that Mark had killed Sarah in a fit of rage. The plan was simple: frame Mark for the murder and get away with it. But Emily had underestimated the determination of Detective Miller. As the investigation progressed, the detectives began to piece together the complex motives behind Sarah's disappearance. The trail of evidence led back to Emily, and it wasn't long before the pieces of the puzzle came together. The family heirloom hammer had been stolen from the Matthews home, and Emily's fingerprints were found on the display case where it had been kept. It was clear that Emily had orchestrated the entire crime, framing Mark and using her jealousy and hatred as motivation. The final piece of the puzzle came when Detective Miller discovered Emily's financial records. She had been desperate for money, and the idea of inheriting Sarah's share of the family fortune had driven her to murder. In the days before Sarah's death, Emily had been in a financial hole that seemed impossible to climb out of. The prospect of inheriting Sarah's wealth, combined with the desire to destroy her sister's perfect life, had led Emily down a dark path. She saw Sarah as an obstacle to her own happiness, and killing her was the only way to remove that obstacle. When Emily was finally arrested and confronted with the evidence, she broke down, confessing to the murder with chilling coldness. She explained how she had used Daniel's presence in Sarah's life as a distraction, manipulating the investigation to make it seem like he was the killer. But in the end, it was Emily's own deep-seated resentment and need for revenge that had driven her to kill her sister. The truth came as a shock to everyone, especially to Mark, who had spent weeks being falsely accused of a crime he hadn't committed. His life had been turned upside down as the police closed in on him, and he had been left to wonder if his marriage had truly been the cause of Sarah's death. It was only after Emily's arrest that Mark was finally cleared of any wrongdoing. The truth had been twisted beyond recognition, and the innocent had been left to suffer while the real killer had walked free. The case was a tragedy of a family torn apart by jealousy, greed, and deception. Emily's actions had shattered her family, leaving irreparable damage in her wake. Detective Miller, who had spent months unraveling the case, was left to reflect on the darkness that could lie hidden beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. The twists and turns of the investigation had been like a maze, leading to an end no one could have predicted. The truth had finally been revealed, but it came at a high cost for everyone involved.